On a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, a woman named Marlene Pemberton stood at the edge of a gravel lot in Grundy County, Iowa, and watched 30 years of her father's life get sold off in 2-hour increments. She was the only woman in that lot, 44 years old. 4 hours of driving behind her, $200 in the pocket of her coat, every dollar she'd been able to pull together on short notice. The auctioneer's voice carried across the cold air like a radio signal cutting in and out. Every time the gavel came down, another piece of what her father had built disappeared into the bed of a stranger's truck. Marley didn't move, didn't speak, didn't show what she knew, because she knew something the auction company didn't, something the men standing around her didn't. Something even the tall man in the Carhartt jacket, the one who kept glancing at her, didn't fully understand. She knew what was on that workbench. She knew what was in those 4 notebooks her father had left behind. And she knew that $200 was either going to be the worst money she ever spent or the most important. She didn't know yet which one it would be, but she was about to find out. And so was every man in that lot who thought he knew better than her. Let me tell you about Stephen Pemberton first, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what his daughter found on that workbench. Stephen came to Grundy County in 1949 with a Polish surname, a German work ethic, and $800 in savings he had accumulated over 6 years of working other men's farms in Wisconsin. He was 26 years old when he stepped off the train in Cedar Falls. He spoke 4 languages. None of them were the kind of English that gets you taken seriously in Iowa. He bought his first 80 acres in 1953 off a neighbor who was retiring. He bought the adjacent 40 in 1955 from the same man's widow. 120 acres. That was his life. He never once borrowed money to farm it. Not once. In a county where the farm crisis of the 1980s had driven a dozen families off land they had worked for 3 generations, Stefan's quiet, debt-free stubbornness looked less like old-fashionedness and more like prophecy. People said he was lucky. He wasn't lucky. He was careful. There's a difference. And Stefan understood the difference the way some men understand weather. He died in the spring of 1987, 64 years old. Heart attack that took him between the barn and the house on a Wednesday morning in April. He was found by his neighbor, Otis Lindgren, who had come over to return a fence stretcher he'd borrowed the previous fall. Stefan was lying face down in the yard, boots on, cap still pulled down over his ears. Otis said later that he looked like a man who had simply decided to lie down and rest, which was not like Stefan at all, but which was also, in some way, exactly like him. Marley was the only child. She had left Grundy County in 1961 to go to Iowa State, studied mechanical engineering, one of just a handful of women in her department. She remembered the first day, walking into a lecture hall, every head turning, a professor looking up from his notes and saying, out loud, in front of everyone, "Miss Pemberton, are you sure you're in the right room?" She had sat down without answering. She had graduated 4 years later in the top 10% of her class. That professor never apologized. She had spent the following 22 years working for a manufacturing firm in Des Moines that made agricultural equipment components. She was good at her job. She understood machines the way her father had understood soil, intuitively, precisely, without having to think too hard about it. But she had not come home. She had visited at Christmas and in summer, had helped with harvest twice when her father's hired man had quit, had otherwise lived her life at a comfortable distance from the farm and everything it represented. This was not a source of conflict between them. Stefan was not a man who asked for things he couldn't have, and Marley's absence was one of those things. But it was a source of quiet guilt in Marley, the kind that doesn't announce itself, the kind that you carry like a stone in your shoe, always there, always slightly uncomfortable, never quite bad enough to stop and deal with. She was 44 years old when her father died, and she had not had a real conversation with him in 11 years. When Stefan died and the estate was sorted out, it turned out that the 120 acres had already been sold quietly the previous autumn to a young couple from Marshalltown who wanted to expand their operation. Stefan had done this deliberately, without telling Marley, because he had known Marley didn't want the farm, and he had not wanted his daughter to feel obligated to pretend otherwise. When the attorney told her this, sitting in his office in Cedar Falls in a brown suit that had been new in 1979, Marley had gone very still. She had said, "He sold it without telling me." The attorney had said, "Yes." She had said, "When?" The attorney had checked his file. October of last year. Marley had done the math in her head. October of 1986. 6 months before he died, he had known, somehow, in the way that some men know things, Stefan had known that the heart attack was coming, had known that there wouldn't be time for the long conversation, had known that if he left the land in his will, his daughter would feel obligated to keep it, or to sell it, or to make some decision about it that would haunt her for the rest of her life. So he had made the decision for her, quietly, without fanfare, without saying a word. The attorney slid a folder across the desk. He left the farmstead itself, the house, the barn, 2 outbuildings, the machine shed, about 4 acres. The contents will need to be liquidated. Marley nodded. She did not know what she was agreeing to. Not yet. Let me tell you about the week before the auction, because that's where this story actually begins. Marley drove up from Des Moines on a Thursday in October to spend the weekend sorting through the farmstead. She had expected it to be a melancholy task, going through an old man's belongings, deciding what was sentimental and what was just old. She had not expected it to take her breath away. The machine shed was a low, wide building. Corrugated steel roof. Concrete floor her father had poured himself in 1962. It smelled like oil and dry wood and something Marley couldn't quite name. A smell that she later described as the smell of time, which sounds like a poet's answer, but which anyone who has spent time in an old man's workshop will recognize immediately. There were 2 tractors parked along the far wall, both older than Marley. There was a workbench along the south wall that ran the full length of the shed, maybe 40 feet, and above it hung tools on pegboard hooks, wrenches, sockets, pullers, gauges, organized with a precision that made Marley stop in the doorway and simply stare. Her father had labeled every hook, not with tags, not with tape, but with a paint pen, directly on the pegboard, in Stefan's small, careful handwriting. Every tool had a home, and every home was occupied. But it was what was on the workbench itself that stopped Marley cold. Because laid out across that 40-foot surface, in various states of assembly and disassembly, was a collection that Marley, who had spent 22 years in the agricultural equipment industry, had never seen assembled in one place outside of a museum. Carburetors from the 1930s and 1940s, disassembled to their component parts, laid out on clean rags in sequence. Magnetos, hand-cranked and battery-powered, from at least 6 different manufacturers. Governor assemblies, fuel pump bodies, water pump housing, a row of carburetors in various configurations, some of them going back to the early 1920s. There were parts Marley could identify immediately, and parts she had to study for a full minute before the function became clear to her. At the far end of the bench, in a wooden case that Stefan had built himself from oak boards and lined with green felt, was a set of precision measuring tools, micrometers, bore gauges, feeler gauges, as clean and calibrated as anything Marley had seen in a professional machine shop. She stood in that shed for 2 hours. Without doing anything, she walked the length of the bench, she picked things up and set them down. She opened drawers and found more parts organized by type and size and hand-labeled cardboard dividers. And then she found the notebooks, 4 of them composition notebooks with black and white marbled covers, stacked at the end of the bench, the kind you buy at a 5 and dime for 50 cents. She picked up the first one, opened it, and sat down on a metal stool because her knees felt suddenly unreliable. Her father had recorded, in his small, careful hand, detailed notes on every piece of equipment he had ever worked on. Specifications, clearances, the particular quirks of particular machines, what had been wrong, and what had fixed it, and what had almost fixed it but hadn't, and why. She read for an hour. She did not cry, but she sat there a long time. and then she opened the fourth notebook. The last one, the most recent, she flipped through it slowly, reading entries from 1,985, 1,986. The handwriting getting a little shakier in the last few pages, the dates getting closer together. And then, on a page near the back, dated February 1,987, 2 months before he died, there was a letter. Not a notebook entry, a letter addressed to her. Marlene, it began. If you are reading this, it means I did not get the chance to say it directly. She stopped breathing. She read the first part of the letter. She read it once. She read it twice. But she did not read the whole thing. Not yet. She got partway through to a sentence that felt like a fist in her chest. And she had to stop. She had to set the notebook down. She had to walk outside and stand in the yard for 10 minutes in the October wind, looking at nothing until her hands stopped shaking enough that she could go back inside. He had known. Somehow, somewhere in the months before his death, Stefan Pemberton had sat down at this bench, opened a composition notebook, and written his daughter a letter he knew she would not read until he was gone. She didn't tell anyone about the letter, not for a long time, but she went back inside the shed, and she kept reading the notebooks. And in the second notebook, buried between an entry from 1,972 and an entry from 1,973, she found something else. A folded piece of paper, yellow with age. She opened it, and she recognized her own handwriting immediately. Even though she had not seen this piece of paper in 29 years, it was a letter. She had written it when she was 15. Dear Dad, it said, I want you to know that I hate the farm. I hate the smell and the mud and the cows and the way you look at me like I'm going to take it over someday. I'm not going to take it over. I'm going to leave. I'm going to college. I'm going to be an engineer like the men who make the tractors, not the men who buy them. I love you, but I hate this place, and I needed to tell you so you would stop hoping. She had given it to him on a Sunday afternoon in the summer of 1958. She had been 15 years old. Furious. Convinced. He had read it at the kitchen table while she stood across from him and waited for him to be angry. He had folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and said nothing. She had hated him for that, briefly, for not fighting, for not arguing, for not giving her the satisfaction of the conversation she had rehearsed for weeks. She had assumed he had thrown it away. She had assumed he had read it once and never thought about it again. Now, 29 years later, standing in his machine shed, she turned the letter over, and on the back, in his hand, was a single line. She means it. Don't hold her back. Marley sat down on the floor of the machine shed. She did not cry. She sat there a long time. The estate sale company came on Friday. 2 men in a pickup truck, a clipboard, a camera, the efficient indifference of people who price things for a living. Marley watched them work. She saw one of them pick up a carburetor, turn it over once, set it back down, with a kind of expression that means this is worth about $3. She saw the other one look at the row of magnetos, write something on his clipboard, without stopping to examine any of them individually. She saw the price they put on the workbench and everything on it. $200. The whole bench, everything on it, everything in the drawers beneath it. The 4 composition notebooks, the oak case with the precision measuring tools. $200. She stood there looking at that price tag for a long moment. She was a mechanical engineer who had spent 22 years in the agricultural equipment industry. She knew what she was looking at. She also knew something the estate sale didn't know, couldn't know, because they had not read the notebooks. She knew what her father had been doing in that shed for 30 years. Let me tell you what Stefan Pemberton had actually been building, because it is not what you would expect from a 120-acre farmer in Grundy County, Iowa. Stefan had not been collecting parts the way some men collect things, randomly, sentimentally, because they cannot bear to throw anything away. Stefan had been, in the most literal sense of the word, practicing. He had been teaching himself over the course of 3 decades to rebuild and restore the ignition and fuel systems of early agricultural engines. The engines that had powered American farming from roughly 1910 through the early 1950s, the engines that nobody else still understood. He had started in the late 1950s, when a neighbor had given him a box of parts from a worn-out tractor that was being scrapped. And he had spent the following winter figuring out how the magneto worked. Not from a manual, he had eventually found a manual. But he had started without one, because that was how Stefan approached problems. You look at the thing, you figure out what it's supposed to do, then you figure out why it isn't doing it. By the time Marley stood in that shed, in October of 1987, her father had rebuilt, by the count, in the notebooks, 247 ignition and fuel system assemblies. For engines spanning 40 years of American agricultural manufacture. He had done this for neighbors. For collectors he had never met. For a small museum in Cedar Falls that had been restoring a vintage tractor for 15 years. He had charged almost nothing. The notebooks recorded what he had been paid, and the numbers were modest to the point of being almost fictional. $5 here, $10 there. A side of beef once from a man in Tama County whose grandfather's tractor Stefan had brought back to life. Stefan had not been doing this for money. He had been doing it because he understood these machines in a way that almost nobody else still did. And because he believed, in the quiet way he believed most things, that understanding was its own justification. Marley knew all of this. Because of the notebooks, she had read enough of them on Thursday afternoon to understand what her father had spent 30 years doing. And she understood, with the clarity that comes from 22 years in the industry, that the collection on that bench was not worth $200. It was worth substantially more than that. Not just in dollars, though the dollars were real, but in knowledge. This was not junk. This was a library. The auction was on Tuesday. Marley had gone back to Des Moines on Sunday, had thought about it for 2 days, had pulled together $200 from her checking account and a coffee can in her kitchen where she kept emergency money, and had driven back to Grundy County on Monday night. She had not told the estate sale company what she thought the collection was worth. She had not argued with the price. She had simply decided to be there when the gavel came down. The night before the auction, she slept in the machine shed, on a folding cot her father had kept in the corner for the nights he worked late. She did not sleep well. She sat up reading by the light of a single bulb hanging from the rafters. She read the second notebook from cover to cover. She read entries from 1964, from 1971, from 1978. She read her father's handwriting and heard her father's voice for the first time in 11 years. He had been alive in those notebooks. In a way, he had not been alive in their phone calls or their Christmas visits. He had been alive in his work, and his work had been here in this shed the whole time, and she had never come to see it. She fell asleep around 3 in the morning. Sitting up, the notebook opened on her lap. When she woke at 6, she had a crick in her neck and a single clear thought. He left this for me. The whole thing. He left it for me. She got up, made coffee on the camp stove, and waited for the auction to begin. The auction drew about 60 people, a reasonable crowd for a farm estate sale in Grundy County in October. Most of them were there for the furniture, the household goods, the small tools, the kind of things that move quickly at estate sales, the kind of things people buy for practical reasons. A few were there for the tractors, old but serviceable. Marley was the only woman in the lot. She noticed this immediately. She was used to it, but it was different here, in a farm community, where the assumption was not just that she was outnumbered, but that she was lost. A man in his 60s walked up to her in the first hour. He smiled in a friendly way. He said, "Ma'am, are you looking for something specific? I can help you find it." Marley said, "I'm fine, thank you." He said, "The household goods are over by the porch. The furniture's behind the barn. This part of the sale is mostly tools and equipment." Marley said, "I know." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "All right then," and walked away. She did not blame him. She had spent 22 years being asked if she was looking for something specific. The machine shed contents were scheduled for mid-morning. After the household goods had moved, Marley positioned herself near the workbench early. She had been there since the sale opened, watching. She had noticed 2 other men doing the same thing, standing near the bench. with the particular stillness of people who are trying not to look interested. One was a tall man in his 50s, canvas work jacket, Carhartt, cap that said nothing on it, which Marley found suspicious. Men who don't advertise are usually paying attention. The other was younger, maybe 35, a John Deere cap, carrying a notebook of his own, which Marley found significant. Men who carry notebooks to auctions are not casual bidders. The auctioneer reached the workbench at 10:47 in the morning. Marley knew the time, because she looked at her watch when the auctioneer said, "All right, let's talk about this bench and everything on it." And the number stuck in her memory, the way numbers do when you're paying close attention to something important. The auctioneer described the lot in the way auctioneers describe things they don't fully understand. Broad gestures, general terms, assorted carburetor parts, magneto assemblies, various ignition components, tools, some old notebooks, measuring equipment in a wooden case. He started the bidding at $50. The tall man in the canvas jacket bid immediately. Marley bid. The younger man with the notebook bid. The tall man bid again. Marley bid. The younger man dropped out at 150. The tall man looked at Marley. Marley looked at the tall man. The auctioneer called for 175. The tall man bid 175. Marley bid 200. The auctioneer waited. The tall man looked at the bench for a long moment. Then he looked at Marley again, and something shifted in his face. Something that Marley didn't understand. Not yet. Not for another year and a half. But something that looked, in that moment, almost like recognition. He gave a small nod, almost imperceptible, and he did not bid again. The gavel came down. $200. Marlene Pemberton bought her father's 30 years of work for exactly what the estate sale company had priced it at, because nobody else in that lot understood what they were looking at well enough to go higher, and because the one man who might have understood decided, for reasons Marley didn't know yet, to let it go. She paid in cash, in 10s and 20s, from her coat pocket. The clerk counted it twice and gave her a receipt. She walked back to the workbench, stood at the end of it, put one hand on the oak case with the precision measuring tools, and realized she was shaking. The tall man in the canvas jacket walked past her on his way out of the lot. He didn't speak. He didn't look at her, but as he passed, she heard him say, very quietly, almost to himself, "I should have bid higher." And then he kept walking. Marley didn't turn around. She didn't ask him what he meant. She didn't ask him who he was. She just stood at the end of her father's workbench with one hand on the oak case and the receipt for $200 in her other hand, and watched the men of Grundy County load other people's tractors and other people's tools into other people's trucks. And she thought, now what? Now what? Now what? She had $200 worth of carburetors and 4 composition notebooks and a letter from a dead man telling her something she had not yet had the courage to fully read. She had a job in Des Moines, a house with a mortgage, a 19-year-old daughter who hadn't called her in 3 weeks, an ex-husband who would tell her she was being ridiculous, a career she had spent 22 years building, and she had just bought a workbench. She started loading the truck around noon. She worked alone. Nobody offered to help. She didn't ask. By 2 in the afternoon, the bench was empty. The drawers were empty. The notebooks were wrapped in a clean rag and tucked behind the driver's seat where they would not slide around. The oak case with the precision measuring tools was on the passenger seat. The carburetors were in cardboard boxes in the bed, covered with a tarp, tied down with twine. She got in the truck. She sat there for a moment. She looked at the machine shed one more time. The door was open. The light was still on inside. She had left it on, deliberately, because some part of her was not ready to turn it off. Not yet. She drove out of the gravel lot at 3 minutes past 2. She did not look in the rearview mirror. She drove south on Highway 14, through Cedar Falls, through Hudson, past the diner in Rhinebeck where her father used to stop for coffee on the way home from the elevator. It was getting dark by the time she reached the outskirts of Des Moines. She did not turn the radio on. She drove the entire way in silence, thinking about the tall man in the canvas jacket, thinking about the letter in the 4th notebook, the letter she had not finished reading, thinking about her own letter, written when she was 15, that her father had kept for 29 years. She means it. Don't hold her back. He had been telling himself that. For 29 years, he had been giving himself permission, over and over, to let her go. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles went white, and she thought, for the first time in her adult life, with absolute clarity, I never came home. I never came home. I never came home. And he never asked me to. She pulled into her driveway in Des Moines a little after 8 o'clock. She turned off the engine. She sat in the truck for 10 minutes. She did not get out. She did not unload the boxes. She did not turn on the porch light. She just sat there in a truck full of dead man's work, outside a house she had lived in alone for 6 years, in a city she had moved to because it was as far from Grundy County as she could get without leaving Iowa. And she said, out loud, to no one, that, what do I do with this? The truck did not answer. The house did not answer. The October wind moved through the maple in her front yard and made a sound like paper. And Marley Pemberton, 44 years old, mechanical engineer, divorced, mother of one, only child of Stephan Pemberton of Grundy County, Iowa, sat in her driveway and understood, for the first time, that her father had been waiting for her to come home for 30 years, and that he had loved her enough to never, once, ask. She finally got out of the truck. She carried the oak case inside first. She set it on the kitchen table. She put the kettle on, and she sat down and opened the fourth notebook and turned to the page dated February 1987. She picked up where she had left off in the shed. She read another paragraph, and then another, and then she had to stop again, because the letter was longer than she had thought, and harder than she had thought. And her father, who had never been a man who said things directly, had said more on this one page than he had said in the last 20 years of phone calls combined. She closed the notebook. She set it on the kitchen table. She would read the rest. Someday, when she could, not tonight. The letter took her 3 weeks to finally read all the way through. She read it in pieces, a paragraph at a time. Sometimes only a sentence. She read it at the kitchen table at 6 in the morning before work. She read it in her car at red lights. She read it standing in front of the microwave, waiting for soup to heat up at 10 o'clock at night. And what she finally understood, after 3 weeks of reading her father's voice in his careful handwriting, was that Stephan Pemberton had not written her a goodbye letter. He had written her an instruction manual. Marlene, the letter said, if you are reading this, it means I did not get the chance to say it directly. I am sorry for that. But I have been telling myself for 30 years that you do not need things said directly. You are not a child who needs to be told what you already know. So I will tell you what you do not know. The notebooks are not for sale. Whatever else happens, whatever the estate company says, whatever your mother's sister tells you about cleaning out the shed. The notebooks come with you, the bench too, if you can manage it. But the notebooks first. There is a man in Ames named Roy Beaumont. He runs a small restoration shop. He knows what is in those notebooks. He has been asking me for 15 years to let him copy them. I have not let him. They were not ready. They are ready now. Take them to Roy. Tell him I sent you. He will know what to do. One more thing. You are the only person I trust with this. Not because you are my daughter, because you are the only person I know who can read what is in those notebooks and understand both halves of it. The mechanical half and the other half. You have always understood the other half, even when you thought you were running away from it. I love you, Dad. That was it. No goodbye, no apology, just instruction. And one sentence that did not behave like the rest of the letter. You have always understood the other half, even when you thought you were running away from it. Marley read that sentence 40 times in 3 weeks. She did not know what the other half was, or she did know, and she did not want to know. There is a difference, and Marley was old enough to know the difference. 3 weeks passed. She did not call Roy Beaumont. She did not call her ex-husband. She did not call her daughter. The boxes from the auction sat in her garage in Des Moines, stacked along the wall, covered with a tarp, waiting. She went to work. She came home. She made soup. She watched the news. She slept badly. On a Thursday evening in early November, she came home from work and stood in the doorway of her garage and looked at the boxes for a long time. Then she went inside, picked up the phone, and called the number Stefan had written on the inside cover of the first notebook. A man's voice answered on the second ring. "Beaumont," he said. "My name is Marlene Pemberton. I'm Stefan Pemberton's daughter." There was a pause. "A long one." Then Roy Beaumont said, very quietly. She said, "Thank you." He said, "I heard he passed in the spring. I should have called. I should have. I'm sorry." She said, "My father left me a letter. He told me to bring you the notebook." Roy was silent for a moment. Then he said, in a voice that had changed entirely, "When can you come?" She said, "Saturday." He said, "I'll be here." She said, "Where is here?" He gave her the address. She wrote it down on the back of an envelope, and she sat at the kitchen table for a long time after she hung up, looking at the envelope, wondering what she had just agreed to. Roy Beaumont's shop was outside of Ames, in a converted dairy barn. She found it without trouble. It was a Saturday morning in November, cold, bright. The kind of Iowa morning where the light comes in at an angle that makes everything look older than it is. The shop had 3 tractors parked outside in various stages of restoration. A hand-painted sign over the door. A wreath on the door, even though it was 3 weeks before Thanksgiving. She knocked once and went in. A man at a workbench looked up. Roy Beaumont, 58 years old, white hair, reading glasses on the end of his nose, a pencil behind his ear, hands that had been working with engines for 40 years. He took one look at her face and said, "You look just like him." She said, "I know." He said, "Come in. Coffee's on. Sit down." She sat. He poured her coffee in a mug that said Moline. She put the rag-wrapped bundle of notebooks on the bench between them. He looked at it for a moment. Then he reached out, picked up the bundle, unwrapped it slowly, set the 4 notebooks on the bench in chronological order. He opened the first one. He read. For 3 hours, Marley sat across from him and drank her coffee and watched him read. He did not speak. Once, he turned pages slowly, occasionally stopped to hold a page closer to the light. Twice he picked up a pencil and made a note on his own pad. Once he put his hand flat on a page and just held it there, as if to feel something through the paper. When he got to the 4th notebook, he slowed down. He read the entries from 1,985, the entries from 1,986. And then he came to the letter in February of 1987. He read it. He read it again. He closed the notebook, took off his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and sat for a long moment with his eyes closed. Then he said, "Marlene." She said, "Yes." He said, "Your father knew things that nobody has written down anywhere else. You understand that. This is not in any manual. This is not in any service bulletin. This is stuff he figured out himself. Over 30 years. Alone?" She said, "I know." He said, "Some of these procedures. The clearance tolerances, the seat angles, the timing curves on the early magnetos. I have been trying to find this information for 40 years. From manufacturers who don't exist anymore. From service departments that closed in 1962. From men who took it with them when they died." He looked at her. He said, "Your father had it, all of it, in his head. And now, in these notebooks." She said nothing. He said, "What are you going to do with them?" She said, "I don't know." He said, "Whatever you do, don't let them sit in a box." She drove home that night with the notebooks in the passenger seat. She did not put them back in the garage. She put them on her kitchen table, and she stood in her kitchen in the dark with one hand on the stack for a long time. 2 weeks later, she walked into Patricia Ashford's office and said the thing she had been rehearsing for 14 days. "Patricia, I'm resigning." Patricia Ashford was 58 years old. She had been Marley's boss for 11 years. She was the only woman in upper management at the firm. The only woman who had ever been in upper management at the firm. She had a corner office, a pension, a husband who did not understand her job, 2 grown sons, a reputation for being fair, a reputation for being difficult, a reputation for being the kind of woman who other women in the company watched carefully, because everything she did set a precedent. She looked up from her desk when Marley said it. She set down her pen. She said, "Sit down." Marley sat. Patricia said, "Tell me what's going on," Marley told her. "Some of it. Not all of it." She talked about the auction, about the notebooks, about Roy Beaumont, about her father. She did not talk about the letter. She did not talk about the other half. Patricia listened without interrupting. When Marley was done, Patricia was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Marley, I want to say something to you, and I want you to hear me." Marley said, "Okay." Patricia said, "I have been at this firm for 20 years. When I started here, there were no women in engineering. None. The first woman they hired after me was you. 11 years ago, I picked you. Out of 40 applicants, I read your file, and I knew." Marley said, "I know. I'm grateful." Patricia said, "I'm not telling you for gratitude. I'm telling you because I want you to understand what you're doing." She leaned forward. "I have been training you to take this office. When I retire in 7 years, I have been training you to take my place so that the next woman they hire won't be the only one. So that the woman after her won't be the only one. Because the door I pried open with my fingernails is going to stay open. Only if there is someone on the other side of it holding it." Marley said nothing. Patricia said, "You're walking out." Marley said, "Patricia." Patricia said, "You're walking out to fix tractors." Marley said, "It's not that simple." Patricia said, "It never is. With us, it is never simple. We are not allowed to have a midlife crisis like a man has a midlife crisis. When a man walks out of his job to go follow his dream, people clap. When a woman walks out of her job to go follow her dream, people say she couldn't hack it." Marley said, "I can hack it. I just don't want to." Patricia looked at her, and something in her face changed. For just a second, something tired, something old, something Marley had never seen on Patricia Ashford's face before. Then it was gone, and Patricia said, "Then you'd better go." Marley stood up. She said, "I'm sorry." Patricia said, "Don't be sorry. Be honest. Be honest about why you're doing this with yourself. If you can't be honest with yourself, you'll end up back here in 2 years asking for your job back, and I won't be able to give it to you." Marley nodded. She walked to the door. She put her hand on the handle. She turned back. She said, "Patricia." Patricia said, "Yes." Marley said, "Thank you for picking me." Patricia did not say anything. She just nodded once, and Marley closed the door behind her. She walked to her car in the parking garage. She got in. She sat behind the steering wheel for 10 minutes without starting the engine, and then she drove home shaking. 2 weeks after that, a package arrived at her house. No return address. She opened it on the kitchen table. Inside was a composition notebook. Black and white marbled cover, identical to the 4 notebooks her father had left her. She opened it. Dates from 1968. Patricia Ashford's handwriting. Notes from the first years of her engineering career. Problems she had encountered, solutions she had developed, the names of men who had tried to undermine her, and what she had done about it. A list 3 pages long of every woman she had recommended for promotion in 2 decades, and what had happened to each one. Tucked inside the front cover was a note. "Marley, I was wrong. Your father left you 4 notebooks. I have no one to leave mine to. Not yet. Go. But don't stop writing it down. B." Marley read it twice. She picked up the phone. She dialed Patricia's office. Patricia answered on the first ring. Marley said, "Patricia." Patricia said, "Yes." Marley said, "I'll keep writing it down." Patricia said, "Good," and hung up. She had not called her daughter in 3 weeks. Joe, 19 years old, sophomore at the University of Iowa, studying biology. Brilliant, stubborn, angry. Angry the way 19-year-old girls get angry when their mothers do something they don't understand. Marley called her on a Sunday evening. Joe picked up on the 4th ring. She said, "Hello." Marley said, "Honey, it's Mom." Joe said, "I know. Caller ID." A long pause. Marley said, "How are you?" Joe said, "Fine." Marley said, "How's school?" Joe said, "Fine." Marley said, "Joe." Joe said, "What?" Marley said, "I quit my job." Silence. A very long silence. Then Joe said, "What?" Marley said, "I quit. I'm opening a shop in Ames. I'm going to restore old agricultural engines." Another silence. Then Joe said, "Mom, are you out of your mind?" Marley said, "No." Joe said, "Dad is going to lose it." Marley said, "Your father doesn't get a vote." Joe said, "What are my friends going to say?" Marley said, "I don't know." Joe said, "How are you going to pay for my school?" Marley said, "I have savings. And the house is paid off, and the shop will pay for itself eventually." Joe said, "Eventually." Marley said, "Yes, eventually." Joe said, "Mom, you have a job, a good job, with a pension. You're 44. You don't just quit. You don't." Marley said, "I just did." Joe said, "For tractors." Marley said, "For my father's work." Joe said, "Your father is dead." It came out sharper than Joe meant. Marley heard it. Joe heard herself say it. There was a pause. Then Joe said, "Mom, I didn't mean." Marley said, "I know." Joe said, Marley said, "I know." But there was a thing in the air between them. After Joe said it, something Marley could not quite name, something she would name later, months later, when she finally understood what was happening between them. Joe was not angry about the tractors. Joe was angry because she was 19 years old, and her mother had spent her whole childhood being the one who showed up, who came to the games, who packed the lunches, who drove her to debate practice, who was always there. And now, for the first time in 19 years, Marley was choosing something for herself. And Joe, who had never had to share her mother with anything she couldn't compete with, didn't know what to do with that. Marley didn't see it that way yet. That night she just heard her daughter say, "Your father is dead," and felt the room get cold around her. She said, "I'll call you next week." Joe said, "Okay." Marley said, "I love you." Joe said, "I know," and hung up. Marley sat at the kitchen table for an hour. She did not cry. She got up, walked to the garage, pulled back the tarp, looked at the boxes, and she said, out loud, to nobody, "I'm going to do it anyway." She rented a small commercial space outside of Ames in February of 1988, a converted farm building, about a mile from Roy Beaumont's shop. The rent was $150 a month. She signed the lease on a Tuesday. She spent 3 months setting up the space. She built a workbench along the south wall, the same configuration as her father's bench in Grundy County. She did not realize this until she stepped back and looked at it. Then she sat down on the concrete floor in the empty shop and laughed for a long time. Or cried. It was hard to tell. The sound was the same. She hung her tools on pegboard hooks. She labeled each hook with a paint pen that she did not realize, until she stepped back and looked at it, was nearly identical to her father's. She opened in May of 1988. She called it Pemberton Restoration Works. She had a sign made. She had business cards printed. She placed an ad in the local farm paper. She waited. The first week, no one came. The second week, no one came. The third week, a man came, a farmer, about 60, in a cap that said Pioneer. He pulled up in a pickup truck with a tractor on a trailer. He got out. He walked into the shop. He looked around. He looked at the workbench. He looked at Marley. He said, "I'm looking for the mechanic." Marley said, "You found her." The man blinked. He said, "Pardon." Marley said, "I'm the mechanic, Marlene Pemberton. I own the shop." The man looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Where's the actual mechanic? The guy?" Marley said, "There's no guy. It's me." The man said, "Ma'am, I don't mean any disrespect, but I got a 1941 Model B that needs the carburetor rebuilt, and I drove 40 miles to get here, and I'd like to talk to someone who can do the work." Marley said, "I can do the work." The man said, "Ma'am," Marley said, "I'm a mechanical engineer. 22 years in the industry. I learned to rebuild a carburetor at my father's bench when I was 12 years old." The man said, 12. Marley said, 12. The man looked at her a moment longer. Then he said, "Well, I appreciate your time." He turned around. He walked out of the shop. He got in his truck. He drove away, with the tractor still on the trailer. Marley stood in the doorway of her shop and watched him leave. She did not say anything. She did not move. Then she walked back inside, sat down on the metal stool at the end of the bench, put her face in her hands, and said very quietly to the empty shop, "What am I doing?" In the first 3 months, she had 2 customers. Both of them were referrals from Roy Beaumont. Both of them were elderly collectors who had known her father. Both of them paid her well and tipped her better. Neither of them was enough. By the end of August, she was running out of money. She had savings, but savings disappear faster than you think when you have a mortgage and a daughter in college and a commercial lease. One night in early September, she stood in her kitchen in Des Moines with the phone in her hand. Patricia Ashford's number on the dial. She started to dial. She got 3 numbers in. She stopped. She set the phone down. She walked away from it. She walked back. She picked it up. She started to dial. She got 4 numbers in. She stopped. She hung up. She stood there for a long time. And then she said out loud, "No, no, no." And she walked out of the kitchen and didn't go back to the phone for the rest of the night. In February of 1989, a collector from Wisconsin drove down to Ames. His name was Lyle Severson. He was 73 years old. He had a Minneapolis Moline from 1,931 inches the bed of his truck. He had taken it to 3 shops in Wisconsin. None of them could fix it. The carburetor surged. The governor wouldn't hold. The engine ran rough above half throttle. He had heard about Marley from a man who had heard about her from Roy Beaumont. He pulled up to the shop on a Wednesday morning. He got out of the truck. He walked into the shop. He looked at the workbench. He looked at the tools. He looked at the notebooks stacked on the shelf above the bench. He looked at Marley. He did not ask her if she was the mechanic. He said, "Are those your father's notebooks?" Marley said, "Yes." He said, "Stefan Pemberton." Marley said, "Yes." He said, "I met him once. In 1979, at a tractor show in Cedar Falls. He helped me with a magneto, wouldn't take payment, wouldn't even give me his address." Marley said, "That sounds like him." Lyle said, "I've got a 1,931 millimeters in the truck. 3 shops have tried. None of them got it right." Marley said, "What's it doing?" Lyle told her. She listened. She thought for a moment. Then she said, "Bring it in." She fixed it in 9 days. She did not rush. She took the carburetor apart on the bench. She laid every part on a clean rag in the order it had come off. She measured every clearance. She checked every spring. She found the problem on day 3. The needle seat was worn in a way that didn't show up on a standard inspection. The standard service manual specified one angle. Her father's notebook specified a slightly different angle for this particular carburetor on this particular engine. Because Stefan had figured out in 1971 that the standard angle didn't seal correctly under load, Marley cut the seat to her father's specification. She reassembled the carburetor. She set it on the engine. She started it. It ran clean, steady, from idle to full throttle. Lyle Severson watched it run for 10 minutes without saying a word. Then he turned to Marley and said, "How did you know?" Marley said, "My father. He paid her $300. He left her a tip of $50. He shook her hand. He said, 'Ma'am, I am going to tell every collector I know about this shop. Every single one.'" He drove away. 2 weeks later, Marley got a letter in the mail. From a newsletter put out by a regional collectors association, Lyle Severson had written a 2-page article about her shop, about her father, about the notebooks, about the carburetor he had not been able to fix until he found her. She read the article 3 times. She framed the letter. She hung it on the wall above the bench. The phone started ringing the following Monday. It did not stop. In April of 1989, a man walked into her shop she had not seen in 18 months. She was at the workbench with her back to the door. She did not turn around when she heard the door open. She said, "Be right with you. Have a seat." She finished tightening a fitting. She set down the wrench. She turned around, and there he was, tall, 50s, canvas jacket, the cap that said nothing on it. The man from the auction, he looked at her. He looked at the workbench. He looked at the notebooks on the shelf. His face did the same thing it had done at the auction. That thing she had not understood. That thing that had almost looked like recognition. She said, "Can I help you?" He said, "Ma'am. My name is Calvin Whitaker. I run a dealership in Rhinebeck." She said, "I know who you are." He blinked. He said, "You do." She said, "You were at my father's auction, October of 1987. He was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Yes, ma'am, I was." She said, "What can I do for you, Mr. Whitaker?" He said, "I've got a customer with a tractor, late 30s model. Carburetor's been rebuilt twice by my shop. Still not right. My best man has been at it for 3 weeks." She said, "What's it doing?" He told her. She listened. She said, "It's the needle seat. The shop manual angle doesn't seal correctly on that one. My father worked it out in 1971. Calvin Whitaker stood very still. He said, "You can fix it." She said, 6 days. He said, "I'll bring it tomorrow." He turned to leave. He got to the door. He stopped. He turned back. He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Yes." He said, "I owe you. I owe your father. I should have at the auction. I should have." She waited. He did not finish the sentence. She said, "Bring me the tractor, Mr. Whitaker. We'll talk about the rest of it later." He nodded. He left. She fixed the tractor in 6 days. The customer called the dealership the next morning to say it was running better than it had in 20 years. Calvin Whitaker drove back to her shop on Saturday morning. She was at the bench when he came in. He was carrying a letter, old, yellow at the edges. He set it on the bench between them. He said, "Ma'am, before I say anything else, I need to give you this." She said, "What is it?" He said, "It's a letter from my wife, Edith, to your father. She wrote it in 1974. She never sent it. I found it in her things after she passed. In 1985. I've been carrying it around for 4 years, trying to figure out who to give it to. When I saw you at the auction, I knew." Marley picked up the letter. She unfolded it carefully. She read it, a woman's handwriting. Careful. The kind of handwriting you learn in a one-room schoolhouse and never lose. "Dear Mr. Pemberton, in the winter of 1973, my husband was in Rochester for heart surgery. I was alone on the farm. Our tractor broke down in a snowstorm. I called every shop in 3 counties. Nobody could come. You came at midnight in the storm. You drove 40 miles from Grundy County, and you fixed our tractor, and you would not take payment. You did not even let me give you coffee. You said you had to get back, and you left. Calvin would have died that winter without your kindness. We would have lost the farm. We would have lost everything. I have been trying to write this letter for a year. I do not know how to thank a man for saving a life he did not know he saved. Calvin does not know I am writing this. He is a proud man. He would not want me to, but I needed to write it, so I am writing it. Thank you. Edith Whitaker. Marley read it twice. She set the letter down on the bench. She looked at Calvin Whitaker. He was standing very still. His eyes were wet. She said, "Mr. Whitaker." He said, "Calvin." She said, "Calvin, why didn't you bid higher at the auction?" He said, "Ma'am." She said, "Marley." He said, "Marley, the moment I saw you, standing there, with that look on your face, the same look your father had, I knew who you were, and I knew I owed your father a debt I had never paid, and I had spent 14 years trying to figure out how to pay it. And I realized, right there, at the bench," he paused, "I realized I could pay it by losing." Marley looked at him for a long time. She said, "May I read the notebooks? May I?" She blinked. She had not expected the question. She said, "Yes." He sat down at the end of the bench. He read for 3 hours. When he was done, he closed the 4th notebook. He set it down. He took a long breath. He said, "I should have bid higher." Marley said, "Yes, you should have." She paused. "But I'm glad you didn't." Calvin nodded slowly. He said, "What are you going to do with all this?" Marley looked at the bench, at the carburetors, at the notebooks, at the shop her father had built her without ever knowing he was building it. She said, "I'm going to write it down." Calvin said, "Good." He stood up. He put on his cap. He said, "I'll send you customers, Marley Pemberton, quietly. I won't make a show of it, but I'll send you everyone I can." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because your father drove 40 miles in a snowstorm and never said a word about it for the rest of his life." He walked to the door. He stopped. He turned back. He said, "There's one more thing." She said, "What?" He said, "I think my Edith would have liked you." He left. Marley stood at the bench for a long time after he was gone. The letter from Edith Whitaker still open on the bench, the 4 notebooks stacked beside it. She picked up the letter, folded it carefully, slid it inside the back cover of the 4th notebook, where the letter to her was waiting, where the letter she had written when she was 15 was waiting, where everything her father had never said out loud was waiting, where she now belonged. She turned off the shop lights. She locked the door. She drove home to Des Moines. She did not cry until she got into her own driveway, turned off the engine, put her forehead against the steering wheel, and finally, let go. The years after Calvin Whitaker walked back into her life are the years that taught Marley Pemberton what her father had been trying to tell her all along. It just took her a long time to hear it. By the summer of 1990, the shop had 3 employees. By 1992, 4. By 1995, the waiting list was 8 months long. Collectors from 6 states, a small museum in Indiana, a man in Minnesota who had inherited his grandfather's tractor and could not let it die. She had stopped sleeping at her bench by then. She had started sleeping in a small apartment above the shop. She had sold the house in Des Moines. She had not asked Joe's opinion on the sale. She had asked Joe to come help her pack. Joe had said she was busy. She had said it on the phone. In the voice of a daughter who is 22 years old and has decided to be busy for as long as it takes, Marley packed the house alone. She did not cry. She just packed 22 years of her life into cardboard boxes with a black marker in handwriting that she still did not realize she had inherited. Joe turned 24 in 1992. She had finished her undergraduate degree in biology. She had gone to graduate school. She had moved to Chicago. She had taken a research position at a hospital. She had gotten engaged at 23 to a man Marley had met exactly twice. A man named Bradley something. A surgeon, older, charming. The kind of man who orders the wine without asking. Marley had not approved. Marley had not disapproved out loud. Marley had said on the phone when Joe announced the engagement, "Honey, that's wonderful. I'm so happy for you." And Joe had heard, in her mother's voice, the thing her mother was not saying, and had not called for 2 months. The wedding was in March of 1992. Marley went. She wore a blue dress. She sat in the front row. She watched her daughter marry a man she did not love. She knew Joe did not love him, the way she had known Stefan was going to die before he did. Some things you just know. She did not say anything. She kissed her daughter on the cheek at the reception. She said, "You look beautiful, honey." She danced once with the new son-in-law. She smiled in the photographs. She left before the cake. She drove home to Ames in her work truck, in a blue dress, at 11 o'clock at night, in the rain. By July of 1992, the marriage was over. Joe did not tell Marley direct. Marley heard about it from her ex-husband, who heard about it from his sister, who had heard about it from a cousin who lived in Chicago. The story, as it came back to her, was that Bradley had been sleeping with a coworker, had been doing so for the entirety of the engagement, had not even bothered to stop after the wedding. Joe had come home one Tuesday afternoon, April 8th, had found him in their apartment, had not screamed, had not cried, had walked into the kitchen, had poured herself a glass of water, had drunk it slowly, and had walked back into the bedroom and said, "Get out." He had gotten out. Joe had not called her mother. Joe had not called anyone. Joe had filed for divorce in August. She had not told Marley any of this. Marley knew, but Marley did not say she knew. She waited because she understood in a way she had not understood when Joe was 19, that her daughter was a Pemberton. And Pembertons do not ask for help. They come home when they are ready. Joe came home for Christmas in 1992. She had not been to the shop yet. She had not seen the apartment above it. She had not seen the workbench her mother had been building for 4.5 years. She arrived on December 23rd. In a rental car with a single suitcase, she knocked on the door of the apartment above the shop. Marley opened it. She looked at her daughter for a long moment. Joe looked tired. Joe looked 24 years old and 12 years old at the same time. Marley said, "Come in." Joe came in. She set her suitcase down by the door. She did not say anything. Marley did not say anything. They stood in the small kitchen of the small apartment. And then Joe said, "Mom?" And Marley said, "I know." And Joe started to cry. Marley held her for a long time without saying anything, without asking what had happened, without saying "I told you so" with her body or her face or her silence. She just held her because that was what her father would have done. That was the thing he had spent 30 years trying to teach her by not teaching her. How to hold something without holding it back. Joe stayed for a week. The first night, she slept 14 hours. The second night, she slept 12. By the third day, she had started to eat again. By the fourth day, she had started to talk. She talked about Bradley, about the coworker, about the wedding she had known was wrong, about the small voice she had not listened to. Marley listened. She did not say much. She made soup. She made coffee. She put extra blankets on the bed. On the fifth night, Joe came down the stairs in her pajamas at 1 a.m. and walked through the empty shop. The lights were off. The workbench was lit only by the streetlight outside. Joe walked the length of the bench. She stopped at the shelf where the notebooks were stacked. 4 of Stefan's, 3 of Marley's. So far, 1 of Patricia Ashford's, Edith Whittaker's letter, tucked inside the back cover of Stefan's 4th book. Marley heard her daughter downstairs. She came down in her own pajamas. She found Joe at the bench with the 4th notebook open on the bench in her hands. Joe had found the letters. Joe was reading them. Marley stopped in the doorway. She did not say anything. She did not breathe. Joe read the letter from Stefan to Marley all the way through. Then she turned the page back to the letter Marley had written when she was 15, the one Stefan had kept for 29 years, the one Marley had not shown to a single living soul. Joe read that one too. She read it twice. Then she looked up. She saw her mother in the doorway. She did not look surprised. She said, "Mom." Marley said, "I know." Joe said, "He kept it." Marley said, "He kept it." Joe said, "Mom, he kept it for 29 years. He wrote on the back of it, 'She means it. Don't hold her back. He.'" She stopped. She started crying again. Marley walked over to her, sat down at the bench, across from her daughter, the same way Roy Beaumont had sat across from her in 1987. The same way Stefan had probably sat with her somewhere when she was small, reading from these same notebooks even before he knew he was writing them. Joe wiped her eyes. She said, "Mom." Marley said, "Yes." Joe said, "I have been so angry at you." Marley said, "I know." Joe said, "For 4 years." Marley said, "I know." Joe said, "I thought you left." Marley said, "I didn't leave." Joe said, "I thought you chose this over me. I thought I wasn't enough to keep you." Marley's eyes filled. She did not interrupt. Joe said, "And I read this letter from Grandpa. And I read this letter from you when you were 15. And I see now. He let you go. He let you go because he loved you. And you. She stopped. She breathed. She said, "You did the same thing for me." Marley said, "Honey." Joe said, "You let me marry Bradley. And you knew he was wrong. And you let me. Because you weren't going to be the one who decided. Because you were going to let me decide. Because that was what your father did for you." Marley was crying now. The first time in her life she had cried in front of her daughter without trying to hide it. She said, "I should have said something." Joe said, "No." Marley said, "I should have." Joe said, "Mom, no. Because if you had said something, I would have done it anyway. To spite you. Because I was 23 and I needed to be wrong by myself and then come home." Marley looked at her daughter. She said, "Honey?" Joe said, "And here I am. I came home." They sat at the bench for a long time without speaking. The shop was quiet around them. The notebooks open on the wood. Outside, the snow was starting to fall on the empty parking lot. The way snow falls in Iowa in December, heavy, slow. The kind of snow that makes the whole world go quiet at once. Marley reached across the bench. She took her daughter's hand. She said, "I'm sorry." Joe said, "What for?" Marley said, "For not telling you sooner. I love you. I love you so much." Joe said, "I know, Mom. I know." Marley said, "But you didn't know, did you?" "Not really. Because I didn't say it. Because in our family we don't say it. Because my father didn't say it. Because his father didn't say it. Because we have all just been writing each other letters that the next person doesn't read until it's too late." Joe said, "Mom." Marley said, "I am going to say it out loud from now on. Every time I think it." Joe started crying again. She said, "Okay." Marley said, "Okay." They sat there a long time until the snow had covered the parking lot, until the streetlight was barely visible through the window, until Joe finally yawned and said, "Mom, I'm tired." Marley said, "Go to bed." Joe said, "Will you come up too?" Marley said, "In a minute." Joe went upstairs. Marley sat at the bench alone. She picked up the fourth notebook. She opened it to a blank page near the back. She picked up a pen. She wrote in her own steady hand, "The 28th of December, 1992. Joe came home tonight. She read the letters. We talked. We talked for the first time. I told her I love her. She told me she knew, but she also told me she didn't. Not really. I am going to say it out loud every time I think it. Dad, you were right about all of it. I wish you had been here. I wish I had come home sooner. I wish I had known what I was running away from was the thing I was eventually going to run toward. But you knew. You knew the whole time. And you waited. Thank you for waiting." She closed the notebook. She turned off the light at the bench. She walked upstairs. She slept that night with her daughter in the room across the hall. For the first time in 4 years, the technical reference came out in 1994. 340 pages. Marley had spent the winters of 1992 and 1993 organizing her father's notebooks, cross-referencing them with her own 7 years of shop experience, adding what she had learned. Without changing what he had learned, she had a small press in Ames print it. 500 copies. The first printing. She priced it at $45. She sold out in 4 months. She printed 1,000 more. She sold those in 8 months. She printed 2,000 more. Those sold steadily for years. She received letters about it from restorers and collectors in 22 states, from a museum in Saskatchewan, from a man in New Zealand who had inherited a tractor from his great-uncle and could not find anyone to help him. The dedication page read, "For Stefan Pemberton, who taught me how to let go. For Joanne, who taught me how to hold on. For Patricia Ashford, who taught me never to stop writing it down." Patricia read the dedication on her own copy of the book. She called Marley. She said, "Pemberton." Marley said, "Ashford." Patricia said, "You made me cry. At my desk, in front of 2 engineers who now think I am having a stroke." Marley said, "I'm sorry." Patricia said, "You are not sorry." Marley said, "No, I am not." Patricia said, "Don't stop." Marley said, "I won't." They both hung up smiling. Calvin Whitaker sold his dealership in 1998. He was 66. He had been in the equipment business for 50 years. His son did not want to take it over. His son was a lawyer in Cedar Rapids. His son had a very nice house and a very nice wife and very nice children and was very, very tired. Calvin sold the dealership to a regional group that absorbed it into a larger operation. Eventually, they closed the Rhinebeck location, moved everything to Waterloo. The building where Calvin had worked for half a century became a parts warehouse for a company nobody in Grundy County had ever heard of. Calvin did not cry, but the day he handed over the keys, he drove out to a field he and Edith used to picnic in the 1960s, and he sat in his truck for an hour. and he did not start the engine until the sun went down. He retired to a house outside of Rhinebeck. He built a small workshop in the back. He started restoring tractors for the first time in his life. Not for money, not for the dealership, not for a customer, for himself. He was not good at first. He had the mechanical background, but he did not have the specific knowledge. He kept running into problems he could not solve. Ignition, timing issues, carburetor behavior he could not diagnose. Governor problems that did not respond to standard approaches. He drove to Ames 3 times in the first year. He bought Marley's technical reference. He read it cover to cover. Twice, he sat at her bench with his cap in his hand and asked questions like a student. Marley answered without condescension. She had the patience her father had had. She had not known until then that she had it. In 2002, Calvin drove to Ames in a pickup truck loaded with parts. He had spent the previous month going through every storage room at the old dealership. The boxes he had not been able to bring himself to look at in 50 years. Parts that had come in on trade-ins. Parts that had been left by customers who never came back. Parts that had been sitting in the back of the building since before Calvin had taken it over from his father. It was a substantial collection. It filled the truck bed. Calvin drove it to Ames himself. He helped unload when they were done. He stood in the shop. He looked at the workbench. The same way he had looked at it the day he had walked in carrying Edith's letter. He said, "I keep thinking about that auction." Marley said, "I know you do." He said, "I think I almost bought 30 years of someone figuring out how to see what other people couldn't see." He paused, and I didn't know that's what it was. Marley said, "I didn't know either until I read the notebooks." Calvin said, "Marley." Marley said, "Yes." He said, "I want to thank you." Marley said, "Calvin." He said, "For letting me back in. After what I almost did at that auction, you could have hated me for the rest of your life. You would have been within your rights." Marley said, "I didn't hate you." Calvin said, "I know. That's the part I keep thinking about." He shook her hand. He got in his truck. He drove away. He came back many times after that. Sometimes to ask a question, sometimes to bring her a part she might want, sometimes just to sit at the bench and drink coffee. He was, by the end, her friend. Not in the way friends usually become friends, in the slower way. The way two people become friends, when they have decided together to turn an old wound into something useful. Calvin Whitaker died in November of 2007. He was 75 years old. He had a stroke in his workshop. His son found him, sitting on a stool, slumped against the workbench, with a wrench in his hand and a half-disassembled magneto in front of him. His son called Marley. He said, "Ma'am, my father wanted you to know." Marley said, "Thank you." His son said, "He talked about you. A lot. He talked about your father, about the auction, about things he wished he had done differently." Marley said, "He did them differently. In the end." His son said, "Ma'am, I have something for you. He left it in his will. I found it on the workbench when I went out there. He had been writing in it right up until..." Marley said, "What is it?" His son said, "A notebook, black and white marbled cover, like the ones he said your father had." Marley did not say anything for a moment. His son said, "He restored 7 tractors, ma'am, in 9 years. He wrote it all down. He said, he told me. He said he wanted you to have it. He said it belonged on your shelf." Marley said, "Yes." She drove out to Rhinebeck on a Saturday afternoon. Calvin's son met her at the house, walked her out to the workshop, handed her the notebook. She took it carefully. She did not open it there. She thanked him. She drove back to Ames in the truck at dusk in November, with a dead man's notebook in the passenger seat, the way she had once driven home from another dead man's farm with another dead man's notebooks. 20 years before, she put Calvin's notebook on the shelf in the shop, next to her father's 4, next to her own 8, next to Patricia's, next to Edith's letter, and she sat at the bench for a long time after she closed the shop that night, looking at the shelf, thinking, "Look at this. Look at what we have made. The man who was almost my enemy, the woman who was almost my boss, the man who was almost my father, the daughter who almost left. All of them. On one shelf, all of them held together by the work and by the letters and by the willingness. Finally, to say it out loud. In the spring of 2012, Marley turned 69. She had been running the shop for 24 years. She had trained 5 young restorers who had gone on to open their own shops in Iowa and Minnesota and Wisconsin and Indiana. She had written 3 more technical references. She had become, by every measure that mattered, what her father had been, only louder. She had said, "I love you" to her daughter on the phone every Sunday for 19 years. And Joe had said it back every single time. Joe was 44, the same age Marley had been at the auction. She was a research scientist now. She ran a small lab at a hospital in Iowa City. She studied childhood diseases. She had remarried at 32 to a kind man named David, a school teacher who made her laugh, who knew how to listen, who had been quietly in love with her for 2 years before she noticed. They had 1 child, a daughter, born in 2004. Her name was Hattie. She was 8 years old in the spring of 2012. She was, by every measure that mattered, a Pemberton. She was quiet. She was stubborn. She was the kind of child who took things apart to see how they worked and put them back together. Sometimes correctly, sometimes incorrectly. Always with great seriousness. She spent summers at Marley's shop. She had her own pegboard hook at the workbench. In April of 2012, Marley told Joe she was retiring. She said it on the phone. She said, "I'm going to give you the shop." Joe said, "Mom," Marley said, "not to run, to own. You can have someone manage the day-to-day, but it should be in our name." Joe said, "Mom," Marley said, "and someday you'll give it to Hattie. If she wants it, and if she doesn't, you'll find someone else." "Who does?" Joe said, "Mom, what are you going to do?" Marley said, "I'm going home." Joe was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "To Grundy County." Marley said, "Yes." Joe said, "To Grandpa's house." Marley said, "Yes." Joe said, "Are you, Mom? Are you sure?" Marley said, "I'm sure." Joe said, "Why now?" Marley said, "Because I finally know how." She moved back to Grundy County in May. The house was still standing. The young couple from Marshalltown had bought the land, but not the farmstead. They had let Marley keep it for a peppercorn rent for as long as she wanted it. The house was the same. The shed was the same. The bench was empty, stripped by her. 25 years before, but the room was the same. The light coming through the high windows was the same. The smell of dry wood and old concrete and the ghost of motor oil was the same. She walked the length of the empty bench. She stood at the far end, where she had once found the oak case with the precision measuring tools, where she had once found the 4 notebooks, where she had once found a letter she had not been ready to fully read. She had brought the 4th notebook with her. She had it under her arm. She set it on the empty bench. She opened it. She turned to the page dated February 1987. She read the letter all the way through. She had read it many times by now. Over the years, she knew it almost by heart. But standing here, in the shed where it had been written, with the same light coming through the same windows, it read differently. It read like a man speaking, finally, in his own voice. The last lines were the ones she heard most clearly. "Whatever brings you back will not be me, or this farm, or anything I leave behind. It will be you. It will always have been you. You will come home when you are ready, not before, and I will be waiting." She closed the notebook. She sat down on the metal stool at the end of the bench, the same stool she had sat on at 12 years old, watching her father take a carburetor apart for the first time. The same stool she had sat on at 15, reading a manual she pretended not to be interested in. The same stool she had sat on at 44, reading her father's notebooks for the first time. By the light of a single bulb, she sat on it now. At 69, and she looked around the empty shed, and she said, out loud, to her father, wherever he was, "I came home, Dad. I came home." The shed did not answer, but the light coming through the high windows shifted, slightly, the way light does in October in Iowa, when the sun moves behind a cloud and then comes back out again. And for just a moment, she could have sworn she heard him, not in words, in the particular silence of a man who has been waiting a long time to put down what he was carrying. She sat there a long time. The shed grew cold. The light moved across the floor. The afternoon turned into evening. And Marley Pemberton, who had once been a 44-year-old woman with $200 in her coat pocket, who had once been a 15-year-old girl who hated the farm, who had once been a 69-year-old grandmother with a granddaughter named Hattie and a daughter named Joe and a shop in Ames that was now in her family's name forever, sat at her father's bench and said out loud to no one and to everyone, "There are things that don't go obsolete. They just wait for someone to understand why they were worth saving in the first place. And sometimes, just sometimes, that someone is a daughter." The bench did not answer. It did not need to. It had already said everything it had to say. 30 years before, in her father's hand, in 4 composition notebooks that she had paid $200 for, on a Tuesday morning in October of 1987, in a gravel lot in Grundy County, Iowa, when she had been the only woman in the lot and had not known yet. What she had just bought